This week on Worldview, as Xi Jinping and Joe Biden meet, US and China decide to resume military communications and aim to work together on artificial intelligence, climate change, and countering narcotics. But despite the bonhomie, Biden calls Xi a dictator. How does this unstable relationship between the world's biggest powers affect India? And what are the takeaways for New Delhi from the summit in San Francisco? Hello and welcome to Worldview at the Hindu with me, Suhasini Haidar. US and Chinese presidents met on the sidelines of what's called the APEC or Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Group Summit in the United States in San Francisco. They met outside San Francisco. The APEC, remember, was set up in 1989 to be a premier forum for economic cooperation in the region amongst 21 countries that include US, Russia, China, Japan, Australia, ASEAN countries, and Taiwan as well. India is not a member, but of course now it's a member of the Indo-Pacific Strategies, Indo-Pacific Economic Forum or IPEF, which met just before the APEC, and China is not a member of those. Now, this was the first meeting between Biden and Xi since the Bali G20 in 2022 and comes at a time of major global challenges. You have the downturn and the lack of economic security around the world, but China in particular, the Chinese economy has slowed down post-COVID. The COVID pandemic itself and the scenario of health security, at any time there could be another pandemic, that kind of feeling, that's another big challenge. The possibility of a US-China standoff over Taiwan, this is a recurring problem. And then there's the Russia-Ukraine war, started in 2022 February, but still no let-up in that. And of course, at present, they're all occupied by the Israel-Hamas conflict. And the US making it clear it will not seek a ceasefire just yet. Now, at the meeting, here's what the leaders said. In fact, Biden recalled meeting 10 years ago when both of them were vice presidents of China and the US. And Xi Jinping called the US-China relationship the most important relationship in the world.
We have to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict. And we also have to manage it responsibly, that competition. That's what the United States wants and what we intend to do. I also believe that's what the world wants for both of us, candid exchange. We also have a responsibility to our people and the world to work together when we see it in our interest to do so. And the critical global challenges we face, from climate change to counter narcotics to artificial intelligence, demand our joint efforts.
China-US relationship has never been smooth sailing over the past 50 years or more, and it always faces problems of one kind or another. Yet it has kept moving forward amid twists and turns. For two large countries like China and the United States, turning their back on each other is not an option. It is unrealistic for one side to remodel the other, and conflict and confrontation has unbearable consequences for both sides. I'm still of the view that major country competition is not the prevailing trend of current times and cannot solve the problems facing China and the United States or the world at large. Planet Earth is big enough for the two countries to succeed, and one country's success is an opportunity for the other. It is an objective fact that China and the United States are different in history, culture, social system, and development path. However, as long as they respect each other, coexist in peace, and pursue win-win cooperation, they will be fully capable of rising above differences and find the right way for the two major countries to get along with each other.
Not smooth sailing, as Xi Jinping said. And more recently, US-China ties have nosedived over a number of incidents. So if you look at the tensions over Taiwan, an election is due there in January, and China claims that the US is playing with fire with its support for Taiwan. After Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit last year to Taiwan, in fact, China snapped those military-to-military communications with the US, and the US has called on China not to change the status quo over Taiwan and not to interfere in the upcoming January elections. Another flashpoint, the US shut down what it calls Chinese influence operations. In fact, they arrested hackers, they shut down Mandarin training centers, as well as each other's consulates some years ago. The US has also passed a number of legislations that ban Chinese goods. It has also pushed its partners to give up Chinese telecommunication equipment, companies like Huawei, and to restrict critical industry, including semiconductor and chip manufacturing in particular, to domestic US manufacturing, what is called the CHIPS Act now. There was, of course, a huge furor over the Chinese spy balloon. It had the US on high alert. China maintained that it wasn't a spy balloon and simply a weather balloon. And of course, China's maps and its aggression in the South China Sea are a growing concern for the United States. And remember, the US has also supported India on its standoff with China at the line of actual control. So in fact, the US and China have a lot of areas of differences. Much like India and China, however, their bilateral trade is robust. And how? The US and China have a bilateral trade of $760 billion. But those growing differences in the past decade have seen a widespread impact. One, on the strategic sphere, as the US sees China along with Russia as its two biggest military challenges. That's in its doctrine now. At 2 million plus, China's military has more personnel than the US, but it lags behind in everything else: expenditure, armored vehicles, naval aircraft carriers, air force as well. On the nuclear front, the US Pentagon actually estimates China has about 400 nuclear warheads, amongst the biggest. And remember, the US has about 30,000. On the economic side, and we spoke a little bit about that, since the Trump presidency, the two countries have slapped more tariffs on each other's goods. In fact, about 6 times more tariffs on each other's goods. So 2/3 of US imports from China today are under tariffs of an average 19.3%, while China taxes about 58% of all US imports at an average of above 21%. And we've seen those exchanges in public. The US is also concerned by Chinese forays around the world, like the Belt and Road Initiative, and now the new ones, GDI, GSI, GCI, or Global Development Initiative, Security Initiative, and Civilizational Initiative. The US seeking partners like AUKUS for the submarine, or Quad, or even IPEF are seen by China as a containment strategy. So they're really ranging off against each other. On human rights, the US has called on China to end human rights violations in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong, other regions, all of which China has dismissed as interference. Given all these flashpoints, the goal for the talks between Xi and Biden was seen much more as crisis prevention rather than dispute resolution. Even after their talks, Biden said that he believed Xi Jinping is a dictator and ruffled some feathers amongst the Chinese delegation. Listen in to what Biden said.
Mr. President, after today, would you still refer to President Xi as a dictator? This is a term that you used earlier this year.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different than ours. Anyway.
Even so, aside from that one remark, both leaders came out of the talks very positive about the outcomes. They called it a candid and constructive meeting. And in fact, you can read the readouts from both sides on the websites of the White House as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing. But broadly, let's just sum it up for you. One was the resumed military-to-military contacts, speaking on a direct basis, which had been frozen since last year. The US and the People's Republic of China, or PRC as it's called, will now talk on counter-narcotics. This was a cooperation also that China had suspended, particularly given the amount of drugs like fentanyl precursors in particular that are causing havoc across the United States. Then they've agreed to discuss the risk and safety issues of artificial intelligence. They've also now signed a pact, which was not at the president's level, but at the special envoy's level on climate change, just ahead of the COP28 summit in Dubai. They have signed an agreement on renewables cooperation and other areas of climate change cooperation, as well as their own commitments on cutting global warming. Then they have agreed to pursue high-level diplomacy. President Biden referred to it as the ability to pick up the phone and have it answered at the highest levels. Remember, in their time, in President Biden's time in the US, He has only spoken to Xi Jinping a few times. He also held one video conference with him, I think during COVID times, and then met in Bali. So this phone diplomacy may actually be a way of moving things forward. The US has also said that it maintains its one China policy on Taiwan, although it will continue to support it and come to its defense when necessary. Now, between those two leaders, there were also some lighter moments. Biden checked out Xi's car, for example.
It's a beautiful vehicle.
啊，这车好漂
对，
亮啊！
我们红旗车，国产，来看一下，真有车。
Oh, it's like that Cadillac we have over there.
就好像我的那个凯迪拉克一样。
Also, we've been hearing from the Chinese side really pushing the memory of what was called the US Flying Tiger Squadron that helped China defend itself from Japan in the Second World War. Now, amidst all of this and all these signals coming out of San Francisco, what should India watch for? And it's a bit complicated, also a little confusing at times, so bear with me. One is a reduction in US-China tensions always helps diffusing conflict in the region around India. China's aggressions, US's counter-mobilization has really added to the tensions and instability, particularly in the South China Sea and in those islands in East Asia. However, conversely, any détente between US and China often leads to India's concerns being pushed aside. So any attempts at what is called a G2, it's a term just meant for the two big powers in the world. And certainly China would like to see most communication happen at that level, at just two countries. That should be watched closely because remember, even on issues like climate change, for example, the US and China have in the past made pacts even while they were negotiating with India and didn't take India's concerns into account. Third, given China's diplomatic push with global powers and within South Asia with countries like Bhutan, the India-China border standoff at the line of actual control really needs to be resolved much more quickly so that the two countries can also move on and discuss other issues. But for that, China has to agree to step back from areas where it amassed troops since 2020. And that so far has eluded the two. Economically as well, India has gained something from the US-China tensions of the past few years, and many US companies like Apple and Microsoft and Tesla are being encouraged to diversify their manufacturing operations in particular and move some of their plants to India. So any kind of end to the tensions between US and China could affect India adversely there. Here's what External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar actually said this week when he was asked about the comparison between India and China. He was in London. Listen in.
Reality, which is the rise of China, there's an equal reality, the rise of India. The rise may be different, the time frame may be different, the quantitatively or qualitatively they may not be identical. But the fact is, as two countries who are really proximate neighbors, who are the two oldest civilizations of the world, who have survived as nation states, who are in a way exceptional nation states because they are civilizational ones. I think there are realities that need to be recognized, and perhaps each one of us has some tradition of how we look at the world, but traditions at the end of the day also have to take into account contemporary realities. I mean, I am today the fifth largest economy. I am the largest in terms of population.
So what's Worldview's take? In a world of global polarization, and I keep talking about this term, any détente between the two big powers that often ask countries to choose between one or the other, obviously that helps India to focus its own priorities rather than being caught between them. So if there's a lack of tensions, that helps India in one sense. It is unlikely that the San Francisco summit will yield more than a working arrangement between the US and China. Tensions could still flare up at any time, so India has to watch for that. Remember, also India's strategic ties with China are at present extremely poor, especially compared to its growing ties with the US. And this asymmetry, the idea that India, or a growing perception that India has somehow chosen a side, constrains India's strategic autonomy on the global stage. So something to think about over there, as the main headline really remains the US and China discussion. Let's get you some reading recommendations on that, and I have to thank my colleague Anant Krishnan, the Hindu's China correspondent, for some of these. The first book, and this I really do recommend theoretically for foreign policy, is a very important one. It's called Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? This is by Graham Allison, who's written about this for decades. He looks at the theory that whenever a rising power has confronted a ruling power, the result has been a war or bloodshed. The other book is called The Avoidable War, A Different Take, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China, by Kevin Rudd. He used to be Prime Minister of Australia. He's Australia's ambassador to the US now. Then there is The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order, How to Bridge the Gap, by Rush Doshi. I've spoken about this book before. Another one Anand recommended, called Superpower Showdown, How the Battle Between Trump and Xi Threatens a New Cold War. This was by Bob Davis and Ling Wei. And it's important, even though Trump is not at present in power, because the US's policies have continued, it's important to read this book. Another one called Stronger, Adapting America's China Strategy in an Age of Competitive Interdependence. Interesting and very thoughtful, by Ryan Haas. The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, by Elbridge Colby. This takes a much tougher line on China and really reflects what a lot in the US Congress are now thinking. The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. This is by Michael Pillsbury. It is a little alarmist, but very, very readable. Two books really on the growing controversies around artificial intelligence, chips and semiconductors. One is called AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley and the New World Order, by Kai-Fu Lee. And then there is a book called Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology, by Chris Miller. Finally, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, by Paul Kennedy. I've spoken about this book before. It looks not just at US and China, but also Russia and other global powers. So we hope you enjoyed this edition of Worldview. Do join us again. Do subscribe to the Hindu's YouTube site, as well as www.thehindu.com. From the team here, thanks for watching.